I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the City of Sonoma Planning Commission for February 8th, 2018. And with that, I'd ask for a call to order.
Commissioner Barnett.
Here.
Commissioner Jansen.
Here.
Commissioner Willander.
Here.
Chair Felder.
Here.
Commissioner Bohar.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald.
Here.
Commissioner Cribb.
Here.
Commissioner Corrado.
With that, I'll ask Commissioner Wellander if he'd lead us in the pledge, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Few housekeeping items. First of all, please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent mode so they don't disturb the meeting. There will be no new items heard before the Planning Commission after 10:30 unless a majority of commissioners choose to move on. I don't think that's too likely with tonight's agenda. And any decision made by the Planning Commission may be appealed to the City Council within 15 days. I think given the what I will be announcing in a second, I don't believe there'll be any decisions made tonight, but we just remind you of that fact. We move on to comments from the public on any items not appearing on the agenda tonight. And let me preface that with a statement that items number 1 and 2 have both been withdrawn, so we will be tabling both of those items. They will not be addressed tonight. So if someone is in the audience and cares to speak on that, I will allow you to have a few moments to speak on it during the comment in this portion of the agenda, because it is not appearing on our regular agenda tonight. With that, anyone would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, please approach the podium. And please state your name and address, and we will keep your remarks limited to 3 minutes or less, please.
Good evening. This is just an introduction for you. My name is Pam Simpson, and I am the interim CEO for the Sonoma Valley Chamber of Commerce. And I am going to be serving in that role until the Chamber finds the CEO that is going to be able to fill that role. We wanted you to know that we were in the audience tonight, and unfortunately I'm not going to be much of a help to you tonight, but I wanted you to know that we are here and we're listening, taking notes, and if there's anything that you need from us, we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Welcome, and happy to have you here.
Good evening. I'm Jim Bohar. I live at 299 First Street West, and I've had to recuse myself as a commissioner tonight because I live close to the 2 tasting rooms that had recently applied for extended outside seating. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. We've had a couple of false starts on this that I'd like to mention. The neighbors and I, 10 of us, I'm one of the 10 property owners and residents there, we object to the seating expansion, and it was on the agenda for January, and we met, we talked, we were prepared to respond, and it was continued. So we again got organized and planned for this meeting. So I'm glad to finally have an opportunity to tell you about our concerns about these issues. We think that
through the chair, I just need to say just something in terms of guidance as far as addressing the Planning Commission. Because you have recused yourself, you need to be very careful when you address the Planning Commission to only speak to your own personal concerns and issues in terms of how you are personally affected by this matter. So you do not want to speak on behalf of other people.
Okay.
And I just, say that because it's just a fine line that, you need to walk in your position. And we just want to make sure that you know, everyone stays in their path, okay?
I appreciate your guidance. I'm just getting familiar with that. Is my time starting now?
Well, we'll give you a little extra on that one.
Okay.
But thank you, David, appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah. So we feel like the expansion of the outside seating on our residential and historic street really is a creeping commercialism into a historic and residential neighborhood. And we think it's going to have some deleterious effects. I feel like it's going to be doing some deleterious effects on value of my house and my ability to reside in peace and tranquility in the neighborhood on a piece of property I've owned for a very long time and been living full-time in for 5 or 6 years. This brings additional noise and alcohol use to the street. At this point, there are people gathering on the sidewalks. They're crossing back and forth between the cars. There's Walt on one side, and there's 2 other tasting rooms on the other side. There's a congregation of people from time to time, and that's going to be increased by the extension of the outside seating. I should also point out that I've been around Walt. I've made a couple of counts of what their seating arrangement is. Apparently, they got ahead of themselves on this outside seating, and they put 24 seats in there in the fall, which gave them a total of about 70 seats. And nobody seems to be very clear on how many seats they should have, but I believe it's around 30, 32. So for the fourth quarter, at least, they had double the number of seats that they apparently were supposed to have. Whatever supposed to have means, I'm not quite sure, because I don't know the substance of the permit or the qualifications from their original installation.
I'm going to ask you to wind it up in another 30 seconds or so.
All this is overshadowed by the fact that Walt started the construction of this in August. Apparently, they were notified by the planning staff that they had to have a permit before they occupy this space. They completed construction, added the seats, occupied it, and were pouring wine to 24 additional people through November, December, January. They removed the 24 seats the day of the first meeting in January. We feel that they have abused the regulations flagrantly and openly, and I request that those improvements be removed and have the soil and the topsoil removed, brought back, and the turf replaced so that it matches the neighborhood as a residential house. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. I'm Tom Dunlap. I own the Swiss Hotel along with my family, and I own all of the property to the north of Walt Winery up to the railroad park with my family. And as a steward of the historic part of Sonoma, my family's made extraordinary efforts to maintain the Swiss Hotel and the Swiss Hotel properties in the most pristine fashion that we could to support the history of the town. At one point, a couple of years ago, we've made some decisions to expand into our old barn, and when we did that, we found that we had to make an exchange for one seating area to allow seating area in the barn. So we found that we were under a restriction in terms of the number of seats that we could have for putting people in our establishment and serving food and beverages. We also own the property north. My sister has those properties. We have the lot. My son-in-law and my daughter own the property all the way up to the railroad park. And we feel that what Walt has done is come in and carried out a construction that was not discussed with the neighborhood. There was no permitting, and they just did things really against what the zoning and the planning commission in the past had indicated that we could do. At one point, we approached the city about putting hotel rooms and so forth on our property, and we were told no, that area is designated as multifamily dwellings, and so we respected that, and we ceased with any of our plans. So I think that it's really incumbent upon the Planning Commission to be very firm with Walt Winery about disengaging in this activity, not allowing it to occur, and removing the what they've already built there without permission or permit. And that also, I think, applies to Auteur Winery, which again has the same sort of appearance, which I think takes away from the historic nature of our neighborhood.
Thank you for your comments.
Hi, I'm Bill Spencer at 319 First Street West, north of the plaza, 6 doors, and next door to the Cooperage Building on the south side of the Cooperage Building. I have a home there in front, and we don't really want any more commercial expansion or parking expansion on our historic residential street. It would make the existing parking shortage worse. It is common that our visiting family and friends cannot park near our homes. Our street and sidewalk already have more than enough congestion, not to mention people who have been drinking too much and jaywalk between cars and across the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Anyone else? Seeing none, we'll close this oh, I'm sorry. Got in under the wire.
You didn't give me much chance to get up there. That's all right. My name is John Chance. I live at 298 First Street West, just next to the depot. My main concern is what they've done without any permitting. They've ramrodded in all this seating. I don't see any variances being made by the council for parking. I did call down to Walt and asked them their capacity, and she advised me that they do parties up to 90 people. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of people that are coming in. In his letter here, he states that he doesn't do any parties and doesn't sell as a wine bar. We are all that live there currently know that full glasses of wine and wine is being purchased and drunken on site as a wine bar and not just a tasting room. Secondly, I'd like to follow up on the moratorium on tasting rooms. I thought we had a moratorium, so any permitting compliance should follow under that, and I don't think anything should be pre-advanced into the schedule. So if there's a moratorium, I think we shouldn't even be hearing this issue at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to make public comment? Seeing none, I'm going to close this portion of the agenda, and we move on to review and acceptance of the agenda in front of us. Does anyone have any changes to be made? Seeing none, we'll close that section and late correspondence.
I think apart from materials that different commissioners brought forward for basically educational purposes, the 2 items of late mail are an email from Jeff Sapelli with regard to wine tasting issues and the issues update.
Thank you. So with that, again, I will repeat that items 1 and 2 that had been scheduled for this evening have been withdrawn, so we are tabling both of those items, and they will have to come back and submit it at a future meeting if they so choose to move forward with those applications. So with that, we will move on to item number 3, which is a discussion of development of updated regulations for the wine tasting facilities. And with that, Mr. Goodison.
Thank you, and hopefully I won't blow up the equipment here tonight. So, well, by way of background, at its May goal-setting retreat, the City Council identified the growing presence of tasting facilities in the downtown area as an issue for community discussion. Of course, wine and winemaking are part of the history and identity of Sonoma, and the wine industry has long been a part of the Sonoma community and economy. However, in recent years, the city has experienced a growing trend of wineries establishing a storefront wine tasting presence in the plaza, and the number of wine tasting facilities has increased in recent years. So the City Council has been examining this issue, back in 2013, 2014, the City Council had examined the issue and made some policy changes, but decided at that time to leave tasting rooms as a permitted use in the commercial zone rather than establishing a use permit requirement. Now, going back to this year, in September, the council held a study session, to consider a variety of information and collectively learn more about tasting facilities. And in the lead up to that item, staff, with the assistance of the Chamber of Commerce, performed research and outreach, including an updated business inventory of the downtown area. We surveyed regulations employed by other communities, and we met with local tasting facility business owners. That study session provided information on several aspects of the issue for consideration by the council and the community. And based on the feedback that was received in September, staff drafted an urgency moratorium ordinance for the council to consider as a means of allowing the city time to study and determine if regulation should be placed on wine tasting facilities and allow the opportunity to research options relating to their regulation. Ultimately, the council at its meeting of December 4th, 2017, adopted an urgency moratorium on wine tasting facilities in the Plaza Retail Overlay District, pending the consideration and study of zoning and other land use regulations pertaining to such facilities. Based on its initial adoption and the subsequent extension that was made in January, the moratorium will remain in effect until September 30th of 2018. So we're in front of the Planning Commission now in a study session format. The purpose of this study session is to basically serve as an educational opportunity with respect to wine tasting facilities, because the Planning Commission has basically been tasked by the City Council to work on updating regulations pertaining to wine tasting facilities. So before we begin that process, we'd like to take this opportunity to just share information with the Planning Commission on a number of background issues related to the discussion. So our purpose tonight is to provide an overview of the downtown economic issues and challenges, learn about industry changes affecting tasting rooms, get information on the state of tasting rooms in Sonoma since the last review was conducted in 2014, learn about the parameters of the moratorium on wine tasting facilities that was adopted by the council, learn how other communities have regulated tasting rooms and understand the policy options that are available to the city, and to lastly review a timeline and next steps for the development of updated regulations. So I'm going to probably skim through this part pretty quickly, but Sonoma's downtown is certainly one of the older ones in the state of California. The plaza dates back to the town's founding as a Mexican pueblo in 1835. So the downtown as we know it today has been shaped by the layout that was established by General Vallejo since that point. Commercial structures followed very quickly, such as the Blue Wing Inn, which opened for business in 1848. And at the same time, the local wine industry was already becoming established, beginning with the 14-acre vineyard associated with the Mission. I like this photograph because it kind of provides a capsule of changes that have occurred in the downtown over the years. So while the town has been insulated from change to a certain extent due to its geographic circumstances, including a relatively small population and Sonoma's distance from the Highway 101 corridor, the downtown has changed a lot in reflection of just national economic trends. So here we have a building that's now the Mercado. It was originally developed as a skating rink that was constructed in 1945. That skating rink was later replaced by Food City, which was a grocery store. And when I first moved to town, Food City was still in operation, but it was very much on its last legs because other competing shopping centers had opened nearby, including the one off of 2nd Street West. So people had different opportunities for grocery shopping that weren't served as well with the Food City model. And ultimately, Food City was shut down, and that building was subsequently renovated and subdivided into multiple commercial tenant spaces, and it's now known, of course, as the Mercado. We've seen all kinds of changes in the downtown, and when I say we, I mean collectively, because I certainly haven't been here for all of them. There used to be blacksmith shops in the downtown, a number of them, drugstores, a number of them, little grocery stores, a number of them. But as the economy has changed throughout the country, so have the country's downtowns, and so has the downtown of the city of Sonoma. And the transition in Sonoma has been a shift to specialty retail. So looking at where we are today, we do want to look back again just a little bit more to 7 or 8 to the 2000s, 2007 in particular. That's when the recession hit hard. And it was felt, obviously, nationwide, and it was felt in the downtown area. And it was visible through a number of vacancies in the downtown area that were hard to fill. There were vacant tenant spaces that were closed for years during this period of time, and property owners were really scrambling to find tenants to occupy those spaces. So when we think about where we are today, we need to remember that the economy is cyclical. That was not the last recession that we're going to see, and it's not the last set of changes in turnover that we'll see in the downtown area. Just a couple of other issues with respect to the downtown in terms of how it's evolved. That Main Street era of having your goods and services in the downtown really shifted in Sonoma probably in the 1970s with the opening of different local shopping centers. Also in the downtown, there were a number of seismic upgrades that were completed in the 1990s that definitely affected a number of different businesses in terms of how those played out because of the substantial investment required to perform that construction. We've all witnessed the rise of the internet and online shopping. And as local serving realtors and services transition out of the downtown, newer businesses are more reliant on tourism and specialty shopping. But while Sonoma isn't immune to larger economic forces, Sonoma does have some characteristics and strengths that are quite unique. In particular, its history and its legacy of historic structures. And lastly, we would just note that commercial rents in the plaza have increased in recent years, actually rather substantially, while rents in shopping center spaces have remained relatively stable. So that difference in rent definitely affects the types of businesses that we see in one location versus another. There are already different kinds of use restrictions within the downtown that have been put into place beginning in the year 2005, really. Concern over an abundance of real estate offices in 2005 led to the creation of the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. That imposed a use permit requirement on ground floor office and special approval findings required concerning the pedestrian character and vitality of the downtown. Later in 2012, the City Council adopted regulations prohibiting large-scale formula restaurants within the downtown, and all other formula businesses are subject to use permit review, again including special approval findings concerning the unique character of the plaza. So those are doors that have been closed. Those regulations limit already the range of uses that property owners can seek in downtown tenant spaces. Now, getting back to the wine industry and tasting rooms, previously I think it's fair to say that wine tasting businesses tended to displace office uses or fill long vacant tenant spaces that have been proven difficult to rent during the recession. But now we are seeing wine tasting facilities fill spaces that have traditionally been occupied by retail. Wine tasting facilities typically had located in smaller tenant spaces and in interior areas, such as the Vine Alley and Sonoma Court shops. Now we're seeing tasting facilities occupy larger tenant spaces and spaces that directly adjoin the plaza. Through the research that we've been conducting on this issue, it's staff's understanding that wine tasting facilities are comprising an increasing proportion of businesses that are looking for space on the plaza. And in some cases, we can see that prospective wine tasting facilities, or even those in place today, represent wineries that are located outside of Sonoma Valley. And just a little note about how the wine industry is been changing lately with a greater reliance on direct-to-consumer sales, which tasting rooms provide a method of accomplishing that. So that's another reason why we're seeing increasing interest in tasting rooms. It allows for that direct sales relationship, which is becoming very important, especially to higher-end wineries. We also need to take a moment to talk about just some regulatory issues related to how tasting rooms and wine bars are licensed. Basically, they're divided into two ABC license types, ABC referring to the State Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control. The Type 2 license, it's also referred to as a duplicate license, that is available to a winery that operates an off-site tasting room under their existing Type 2 license. So if you are a winery, you've got a site where you're processing your grapes and making your wine, you've got a Type 2 license. The ABC will give you a duplicate license to open a tasting room at an off-site location. Wine bars, under that license, you are only able to serve wine that you make at your winery. A wine bar, on the other hand, is a type of facility that can offer wine from multiple wineries. And that typically employs a Type 42 license. So that type of license not only authorizes the sale of wine, it authorizes the sale of beer. It's not limited by the ABC. It might be limited by a use permit, but it's not limited by the ABC license. So that's a type of license that allows, again, sales from multiple different wineries. Now, we've seen some Type 2 licensees band together. So in the tenant space, it's now Pangloss. That used to be occupied by 3 separate Type 2 licensees that, were sharing the rental of that space. So that's how you sometimes see something like a hybrid of the Type 2 and the Type 42. So again, the city most recently looked at its regulations pertaining to wine tasting facilities and wine bars and tap rooms in 2314. And in that review, new definitions were established in the development code for wine tasting facilities and for wine bars and tap rooms. Operating standards were established, including limits on food service, limits on hours, and limits on wine club events. Through those regulations, wine tasting facilities remained a permitted use in the commercial zoning district, meaning that no use permit requirement applies for such a business opening, for example, in the downtown area. On the other hand, wine bars and tap rooms do require a conditional use permit, even in the commercial zone. And we've been talking a bit about the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone, so let's take a look at that right now. It's a relatively limited area of parcels that are within about a half a block of the plaza. So that area has been the subject of, different kinds of basically ongoing inventory. The Chamber of Commerce for years has been tracking business activity in the Plaza Retail Overlay District, which has been of a valuable service in this discussion because it helps us understand the changes that have occurred over time. So looking at where things are today, this is the composition of businesses within the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. So retail is dominant at 39%. Restaurant and food services are next at 19%. Wine tasting and sales are close behind at 17%. Then you have a couple of full bars. You've got different service uses, including banking, finance, and real estate. You have different kinds of combination uses and cultural and entertainment-based uses. So how has that changed since 2012? Well, the share of retail has gone down somewhat. The share of restaurants and food services has gone up somewhat. And the share of wine tasting and sales has gone up quite a bit. It's nearly doubled from 9% to 17%. Interestingly, the number of wine bars and tap rooms has remained pretty much the same, as is the number of full bars. And these maps provide another picture of the change in the number of tasting rooms that's occurred between 2012 and 2017. Now, there's a lot of different parties to this conversation, in addition to the decision makers like the Planning Commission and the City Council. We want to hear from residents, we want to hear from the business community, and we want to hear from local wine tasting owners. And so, as part of the lead up to the study session that the council held last September, staff did meet with representatives of local wine tasting businesses and the Sonoma Valley Vintners and Growers to just get their perspective and hear some of their concerns. So the points that they made to us were that wine tasting businesses are, for the most part anyway, locally owned and sell local products. And they view themselves not as an outside industry, but as part of Sonoma Valley and its history. From their perspective, the tasting room experience connects local residents and visitors to the agriculture of Sonoma Valley, which in their view helps support the preservation of agricultural lands and agricultural activities. It's their perspective that local residents, and they've provided information on this that I need to actually forward to the Planning Commission because I didn't include it in this packet, that suggests that local residents actually constitute a significant proportion of wine tasting customers. And they suggest that the city take steps to just simply make it easier and less costly for businesses of any type to open. There was general agreement from those attending on a couple of points. First, they agreed that maintaining business diversity in the downtown is important. And they want to seek a way to protect Sonoma-based wines and viticulture in Sonoma Valley tasting rooms. All right, so now let's talk about the moratorium that the council recently adopted, because that is the vehicle that is allowing us to take some time to review and develop updated regulations while putting a pause on applications for new wine tasting facilities. So what does the moratorium do? The moratorium prohibits the approval of new wine tasting facilities. Where does it do that? It does that in the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. Are there projects that aren't affected by the moratorium? Yes, there are. Those are projects for which a building permit has been applied for or is under review, where a business license has been issued, or where a project just under the law has a vested right to proceed. And existing wine tasting facilities are not subject to this moratorium. So I just wanted to call up this map one more time because, again, I want to highlight the area where the moratorium is in place. This is a list of businesses have been identified as being in progress with respect to the moratorium, so they will be allowed to proceed. So we've got a couple of those, including at 414 First Street East in the El Paseo, at 27 East Napa Street in Sonoma Court Shops, second one in Sonoma Court Shops, and one at the Shug Winery and one in the Mercado. And then there's an active building permit at 497 First Street West. So, what kinds of options are there to regulate wine tasting facilities? In talking to other communities, there are quite a wide range, actually. First, many communities require a use permit for a wine tasting facility, or perhaps some other permit type could be contemplated. Some communities have a requirement for local sourcing, and by sourcing, what we're referring to is where do the grapes come from? There are communities in Napa Valley and elsewhere, for example, that require that 75% or some other percentage of the grapes be sourced from Napa Valley. Some communities have a retail component requirement. That is, they'll allow a wine tasting facility, but they require that it include sales of some other retail item or items. On the other hand, there are other communities that say if you're going to open a wine tasting facility, you can't sell anything else. There are options in terms of geographic or concentration policies. So, for example, in the town of Healdsburg, they have proximity limitations on wine tasting facilities and limits per block face. And then there's a possibility of just considering an overall numeric limit. So here are just some examples of other communities and the types of regulations that have been employed in different locations.
And David?
Yes.
If Sonoma was on here, it would all be red currently?
Correct.
Okay.
We don't have a use permit requirement, and so we can't really require anything else because there's no mechanism to do so. And wrapping up, this is a draft timeline that we've developed for reviewing, discussing, and ultimately implementing updated regulations on wine tasting facilities. So we're starting out here in February with an introductory discussion with the Planning Commission. In February and March, staff's going to be having ad hoc meetings with different interested parties, and we've already begun outreach to do that. In April, we'll come back to the Planning Commission with a study session in which, at which time the Planning Commission would make recommendations to the City Council on regulatory options. So that won't be an ordinance. That's going to be broad direction from the Planning Commission. In May, we'll take those recommendations to the Council and get their direction based on what they're hearing from the Planning Commission. That gives us June and July to develop and review a draft ordinance with the objective of bringing back a draft ordinance to the City Council in August. So that's, again, what we're looking at as a timeline. Now, we're here tonight, again, not to set policy, not to make decisions. This is an introductory educational workshop. But what we are here to do is hear from interested people and hear questions from the Planning Commission and hear from the Planning Commission in terms of issues that you would like staff to explore or investigate as this process moves forward. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there questions of staff at this point?
David, regarding the schedule of events, on the February and March ad hoc meetings, is that something that would be open for commissioners to attend?
No.
Question. On the table and in the charts, the table on page 7, what's listed as culture and entertainment. I'm just wondering, does that include the historic resources? I mean, are we talking about the barracks, the mission, and are those part of our culture, and are those things not included at all in this.
Well, they're certainly part of our culture and our entertainment, but what they're not part of is the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone.
Because
So
they're specifically excluded from the.
They are excluded because we don't regulate those state-owned
Okay.
properties.
Okay.
But, you know, that's obviously not to say that they aren't critically important to the downtown.
Okay.
So something like culture and entertainment is the Sebastiani Theater.
Got it, okay.
Carol?
Yes. First of all, Mark, I just want to say, I don't know who wrote this report, whether it was you or someone else on your staff, but it's beautifully written, and it's very informative. Did a lot of good work on it, okay?
Well, thank you, then I'll take credit for it.
Okay. It says from you, so I presume so. But on the other hand, everything out of your office presumably comes from you. But I do have a few questions, if I can ask them. And I'm just going to go in the order that they came to me as I was going through the report. Have there been any legal challenges to, say, other use permit requirements or restrictions, other use restrictions that you've applied in the city, like the large-scale formula restaurants restriction?
No, the city of Sonoma has never been challenged on any of those types of regulations.
Okay. How about, say, do you know whether or not in St. Helena, for example, where they have different wine tasting restrictions that seem kind of loosey-goosey to me? Do you know if there's been any legal challenges to other cities?
Well, let me just say it a different way. I haven't done research on legal challenges pertaining to the regulation of wine tasting facilities. The last set of issues that we looked at in terms of regulatory challenges was focused on formula businesses. And there is some case law in that area that, you know, may or may not be applicable in this instance. But as part of our review process, we will look and see if there have been any challenges or case law, you know, specifically on this point.
Okay, all right. And then in the ordinance that is here, is that, I presume, the proposed ordinance that went to the council at some point? The ordinance that is attached here?
Oh, those are the existing rules today.
The existing rules today, okay?
Yes.
So can you tell me, because I don't have the history behind me, all right, what is the reasoning for the food restrictions?
It's so there are food restrictions in both wine tasting facilities and on wine bars and tap rooms, and that is to maintain a clear distinction between those uses and restaurants.
Okay. And let's see. The hours of operation that were put into place with that ordinance, okay?
Yes.
Okay.
But I need to be clear about something that oftentimes isn't clear. There are any number of wine tasting facilities, probably at least 13, that open prior to those new regulations coming into place. So whatever hours they had, they get to keep because they are a legal non-conforming use that is not affected by that 2013 ordinance. The 2013 ordinance only affects facilities that came in following its adoption.
Okay. But if the hours of operation is something that could be changed in the final ordinance?
Yes.
I'm more interested in the ones that's the evening operations, okay? Does that apply to all operations within the wine tasting or simply the outdoor operations within the wine tasting?
All right, so the hours allowed under this 2014 ordinance, let me correct that, are from 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. It states that more restrictive hours may be imposed through the use permit process. So, wait a minute, let me make sure I've got this right. 8 a.m. I was looking under wine bars, tap rooms. We're talking about wine tasting facilities. So, hours for by appointment invitation only functions shall not exceed 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. Hours of operation for general public access shall not exceed 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. outdoor seating proposed in conjunction with the tasting facility that adjoins a residential zoning district shall be subject to use permit review. So in use permit review, you could require more restrictive hours, but
Okay.
otherwise not.
So
Under
if
the
it's
current
inside only,
rules.
it can go until 10 PM.
Correct.
Okay, got it. Okay, and then there's another provision in this ordinance that says the outdoor seating next, that it's, it speaks to next to a zoning district, okay?
Yes.
And does that mean, okay, just the district? So if it's actually a residential use, but it's zoned commercial or some other,
Then that does not apply.
is that something that is, from your perspective, changeable?
Well, A, it's changeable. B, it would only apply to, new facilities going forward after the change is made. And C, it's something to be cautious about when you consider such a change, because, for example, Sonoma Court Shops is a mixed-use project. It's got apartments upstairs. It's zone commercial.
I got it.
Can there be a restaurant downstairs with outdoor seating, or a wine tasting facility with outdoor seating? And what's the preference in that regard? I mean, the preference has been that the commercial use takes precedence.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I have a couple of questions. David, could you clarify for me? I just wanted to understand, are wine tasting bars and tap rooms, are they allowed or permitted in mixed-use zones?
With the use permit?
With the use permit only, okay. And I had kind of more of a general question about sales tax and collecting sales tax and the point of sale. And I think I sent you an email trying to understand how much sales tax is being generated by wine tasting rooms versus wine tap and bar establishments. And I wanted to understand if a tasting room had a wine club and somebody was purchasing a case a month, say, from the wine club, and they are doing that and making that transaction in the city of Sonoma, would that sales tax come to the city of Sonoma in return, or would it possibly go to where that winery is, say, for example, in the unincorporated area? So I just wanted to see maybe if you can clarify that for me. If not, maybe at our next meeting, so we get an understanding of, like, for these businesses, are they generating sales tax for the city?
That's information that unfortunately I was not able to get to the Planning Commission tonight, but it is something that we will investigate and we'll be able to report back on the next time this comes before you.
Okay, great. And then my last question has to do with those wine tasting rooms that already either have a use permit or they have are permitted in the zoning district. And now that we have a moratorium, I'm curious, can a business that has a permitted use, can they apply for expansions while we're going through a moratorium and this zoning code review, or would those be suspended until we are comfortable in processing permits and design review for, say, outdoor seating?
All right. So it says on page 3 of the moratorium ordinance is that whereas the purpose of this ordinance is to extend the prohibition against the establishment of or the allowance of new additional wine tasting facilities within the Plaza Retail Overlay District, pending this consideration, study, and possible adoption of permanent regulations governing such development and use. So, I mean, based on that construction, at least as I read it, this is a moratorium on permitting new wine tasting facilities in the Plaza Retail Overlay Zone. So it doesn't appear to
You know,
Well,
David,
let me just say this. That's something that I've asked the city attorney to weigh in on. How about we leave it at that?
Okay, thank you. I just kind of a little confused as to what we're supposed to be doing, so thank you.
I have a few questions, and I guess we'll leave it at that for that, because in section
Yeah.
2, it sort of
Yeah.
contradicts that. My first question is the sort of concept of, and at least contribution of law enforcement and their views. I know that just remembering the tasting room discussion back 5 years ago, law enforcement seemed to sort of be involved in the discussion, at least at the study session level. And there was some discussion, at least back then, about, in one of the newspaper articles, Chief Sackett said that we can't rely on the ABC license to regulate wine tasting without local zoning regulations, and that together, local zoning regulations could potentially help the ABC, because apparently there's a whole thing about the letter of public convenience or necessity, and the ABC doesn't just automatically grant these ABC permits and these different licenses. And I was wondering if anything has changed since then.
No, I think it's important. You make a really good point about the ABC license. People may get the impression that the ABC license regulates all kinds of different things. It really doesn't. It's pretty simple. And the ABC doesn't like to attach custom requirements to an ABC license. They don't like to do that. So if there are going to be requirements based on local conditions, those have to be developed and implemented by the locality. ABC is not going to do that.
Right, right. He also said back then, the police chief said that Sonoma has a much higher number of off-sale alcohol establishments than recommended by ABC criteria. And so going forward, at least in terms of offering new input, I think it would be good to have, continue to have, or at least the same level of input from law enforcement than we did 5 years ago. Another comment I have, again, 5 years ago, it seemed like at least options for discussion was, a use permit as it is today, but there was a discussion about a retroactive use permit, and they decided then not to make them retroactive. And I'm curious, has anything changed on that in terms of an option?
Well, at least in our discussions with the city attorney, I don't believe that I don't believe that they believe that that's an option. We can certainly get a more definitive statement in that regard, but that's my understanding.
Okay. Well then, yeah, I would like that
You bet.
further explored. Another comment I have is, or two questions. First, the timeline. It seems like the timeline is fairly, at least in terms of how typically things are done in Sonoma, fairly aggressive, and I'm curious why.
Well, we were asked to develop a fairly aggressive timeline.
By the city council?
Yes.
Okay. And then my last question is, in terms of noticing of this meeting, how did we sort of, at least beyond just putting an agenda online, are there, because I know tasting rooms are a very divisive issue and there's a lot of input, and I'm just curious how there was no newspaper article, there wasn't much, at least, I think, public knowledge about the fact that we're talking about such an important issue. And going forward, what tends to happen is we start these discussions at the planning commission level, and sort of the ball gets rolling down the hill, and then everyone comes to the city council meeting and starts yelling, and it would be better if everyone is sort of involved in the process, like, right now. And so I'm just curious how we sort of noticed this.
Well, just
Beyond.
since this discussion began, we've been developing basically an email list, and we've been developing that email list for more than 6 months now. So that's what we're doing, or that's what we've been doing. And, we certainly welcome suggestions for improved notice. because
that's
we
sort of-
want this to be a community discussion.
Right. In the staff report, you talked about how you, in drafting the staff report, you met with the vendors and growers and tasting room representatives. Did you meet with anyone else?
Yeah, I met with some concerned residents,
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
but it wasn't a formal meeting, so I didn't present it as such. And I want to add that, in the timeline that we're looking at of outreach over February and March,
Right.
we want this to be a community outreach, and that means not just interest groups, but, not just
Right.
business interest groups, but the community.
No, I agree. I think it's very important. Thank you.
So you
More
just-
questions?
Yeah, I just, I was concerned with the line of questioning here, and just that, there was nothing about this that didn't follow our normal noticing process, correct? We put the legal notices that we normally put in the paper. We posted it outside the visitors. Was there something
Oh,
about
it's a
this that was
perfectly legal meeting, but I just took the point to be that, we do want to have community input. We don't want people to be surprised by the fact that we're having this discussion, and so, we
Yeah,
just want to do our best.
Yeah. It was more of a
Yeah.
I would just want people in the audience to understand that this was a perfectly noticed, a legally noticed meeting.
Yes, yes,
Through
it
the
was.
normal channels, if anyone that follows our public meeting process knows where that information is always.
Well, but this is a bit of an anomaly because this is not a public hearing that required the 20-day notice. It's a discussion item. So it did not appear in the newspaper.
And
in
can I
20
follow up?
days.
Yeah, so I thought all our meetings were noticed in the paper.
Only if they have
I
to be public
certainly-
hearings.
My point was, it seemed like in preparing the staff report, there was outreach to the tasting room community and the vendors and growers. And clearly, I'm sure they were noticed, and I through an email chain. I was just curious if the larger community was noticed. In addition, to follow up on Chair Felder's point, this is 2018. Social media is a good way to get the word out. The city council meetings, they have a Facebook page for city council. They sort of notice and let people know what's going on, and I know that didn't happen, and I'm just bringing it up to encourage the fact. I certainly didn't imply the meeting was not legally publicly noticed. I was
Okay,
just
yeah, it
asking.
was just, it appeared, the agenda was, on the city website, and,
James,
least
no
that's where
one's
I saw-
saying
yeah,
it wasn't. I
yeah,
was just
okay,
saying
okay.
there are better ways to, this is obviously a
Let's move
very
on.
controversial issue.
Let's
Yes.
move on. Any other questions of staff? Yes, Linda?
Just one quick question. What is the difference between a tavern and a wine bar?
Well, a tavern can serve all manner of alcohol. A wine bar, tap room can only serve beer and/or wine.
Kind of related to Linda's question, reading over the description of a wine bar and a tasting room, what's the difference in the regulation issue regarding both of those? They are a little bit different in terms of what they serve and so forth, but is there any difference in the overall regulatory issue as far as number of seats and hours and all that stuff? Because they seem to operate the same way. Are they regulated in the same way right now?
Well, they operate in a very similar manner, but locally, wine bars and tap rooms are subject to use permit review already.
Okay, so these regulations will perhaps, depending on how it evolves, make them more equal in regulatory issues. Is that accurate?
That's quite possible.
They certainly seemed, I would certainly want to look to evaluating that issue because they're operating in much the same way. And it seems like issues like outside seating, which is not regulated much at all with wine tasting, should be, if I could make that distinction.
We're in a question period.
A couple of other points about, I appreciate the historical background that you gave us. I'd like to just make an observation that looking at the rents going up from $2 to $5, for example, on the vacant spots on the square, that That's certainly what happened. That's the facts. And the facts were, as we had an event of an economic downturn. I think also we don't want to go too far in making a cause and effect there between the fact that they were available and the rents didn't just go up magically, I don't think. I think the tasting rooms had the ability to pay more rent, and I think they had a real effect on the rent going up from doubling, essentially, from what retailers were paying. And I'd just like to make that point. As well, I think the issue of the wine tasting rooms, which typically had a bar and 3 or 4 stools or something like that, without regulations, they have morphed into bars in many senses. And the existence of unregulated outside seating has caused them to morph into what you'd really call a bar. And I think we can walk around town and tell which ones those are. Lastly, the issue of direct wine sales being an element of the business plan of the winery. I would like to suggest that it's also a possible situation that the wine tasting bars opened and they saw an opportunity to augment their profits, so they expanded that in a dramatic way because it was possible. And lastly, I would say I respect and admire the wine industry, but it's a business, and these are alcohol serving establishments, and we need to treat them as businesses. Separating it from the romance of the wine industry, sometimes I feel like the people wanting to regulate the tasting rooms are somehow critical of the wine industry, and I'd like to separate those two issues. These are tasting rooms and bars.
Let me remind you, Commissioner Bohar, that we are in a question of staff, not an opinion.
I finished my opinion, and thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have questions?
I have a couple more questions now.
Okay.
Really has to do with, maybe David, you could help me. I'm trying to understand the difference between like a tasting room and a restaurant, say, or even a retail space, in terms of what the building code requires for ADA compliance and standards for upgrading businesses. Because a lot of times, you know, I hear people say, oh, I wish there were more restaurants in Sonoma, and then the flip side is it's very difficult to convert some of these historic buildings into restaurants. So, and it's easier for a tasting room to go in, or and so could you maybe give us some clarification as that? A lot of it has to do with possibly the fact that it's easier to put that type of use into a business, so there's less up cost in terms of establishing a business. Maybe you can clarify that for us. And then also my second question is, in a wine tasting room, what are the requirements that allow underage people in those facilities? Not a bar, not a wine bar or a pub or tavern, but a wine tasting event or venue.
Okay, probably some of this stuff I'll need to look into, but I mean, one difference between a restaurant and retail and a tasting room is that a restaurant is going to already needs a use permit. So that's a process that one has to go through to establish a new restaurant within a tenant space that hasn't otherwise been occupied by that. A restaurant also has, even on the lower end of facilities, you know, health department inspections that are different than and more costly than associated with retail or wine tasting. ADA requirements are definitely different for restaurants and retail. I don't know if ADA requirements are different for retail and wine tasting, so I'll have to look at that. I'm not certain.
Yeah.
On the underage limits, in terms of having some kind of group activity at the tasting room, I will have to look at that too. I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could give us some clarity on like obstacles for other uses. And
there are probably people in this room who know the answer to that question, so we may learn very shortly.
Yeah, thank you.
If there's no further questions, I'm going to take it out to the public. So if We would limit you to 3 minutes or less if you wouldn't mind, and please approach the podium if you're ready.
Good evening, Commissioners. Larry Barnett, 5th Street East. You've, as a group, come up with a number of the issues that I would have touched on. I feel a little bit like Yogi Berra here tonight, having deja vu all over again. 5 years ago, we had a discussion, not dissimilar to this, but with a lot more people in attendance, with the Planning Commission to talk about this very issue. At that point in time, there were maybe 12 to 15 tasting rooms on the plaza. When I said that there was probably in an unregulated situation, it's likely the number was going to double, I got castigated for it by a number of people, and the free marketeers in the audience all said, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's exactly where we are today. And so here we are having essentially the same discussion we had 5 years ago, except now you've got grandfathered uses. You've got roughly 30 places, including the ones that are got applications in that haven't been processed because of the moratorium, who are there forever. They cannot be turned into use permit situations. They are permanently granted the right to have this use. It goes with the property. It goes with the parcel. It doesn't go with the business. So what was predicted 5 years ago has come to pass. We've essentially established a new baseline of roughly 30 wine tasting rooms and wine bars in the downtown area. And it's only going to go up from there, of course, because that's the baseline. There's a couple of issues that have come up. I think the exterior expansion issue has intrigued me. I noticed that, I think, as Roche Winery on Spain Street now has, from what I can tell, is a permanent year-round tent that essentially covers their outdoor space. Now, I'm wondering why it is that a permanent tent is not considered an indoor space. Is it because it doesn't have solid walls? Is it because it's made of plastic and it's got some ropes? Fact of the matter is it is functioning as a year-round indoor space with heaters. That, to me, is not outdoor seating that is casual and based on the season. It's basically the expansion of an indoor use into an outdoor space. I would like to see some hard data about the economics. And I'm not sure exactly how it could be done. Perhaps the chamber can help in this. How much revenue, that is in terms of wine club sales, is associated with these locations? How much is the city missing out on sales tax revenue? If it gets shipped from their warehouse on 8th Street, we don't get any of the sales tax. I'd like to know what those numbers are, and I think the commission could benefit from that too. And if I could have just one more minute, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that the same goes for the issue of a rent survey. I really don't know what anybody's paying for space on the plaza anymore. I think it'd be very valuable to do some comparisons between what the wine club facilities are paying, wine tasting rooms, and the regular retail uses. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Next.
Hi, Tom Conlon, 18850 Robinson Road. Just wearing this hat, Sonoma, you know, hats float around, no affiliation. I just wanted to thank David for making some significant improvements to the report that was presented previously to the City Council. He got beaten up pretty hard for it, I think, last time, and it's gotten better, and there's a lot more information in there. And I just want to thank everybody here for revisiting this issue and putting good attention into it. You know, Larry's comments, there's a lot of people that are concerned. We're looking to you guys for balance as we move forward. I know that the tourism district is working on a tourism benefits. I think of it as a benefits study. They're going to be quantifying the economic benefits of tourism in the valley, and I think that's a great idea. I think we need to know that. But analogous to the hidden in plain sight study that looked at the demand for philanthropy in the valley after the Economic Development Board had done a study of the supply of philanthropy. I think we need to be sure we do a good job of taking a full look at tourism in the valley, not just the positive side. Similar to what you're going to be doing with the cannabis study. So I'd encourage the merger of these two studies, so we really see how people who are coming here for recreation, how they are impacting the local community, the various different business models that are going to be already in place and changing as cannabis becomes more prolific. And again, I heard mention of Brett Sackett's comments. He spoke to some of these matters at the Sustainable Sonoma Roundtable last week, and I think we need to think about the impact on our children when we have so many alcohol-based businesses in our community, just the cultural impact of having that. So I appreciate that our economy is very much entwined with all of this, but we need to step back and come to some kind of balance about this. So I'm sure that that's why you're all thinking about this now, and I appreciate your time put into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kahn.
Good evening, Fred Allbach, 8th Street East. I think the tasting room issue is directly connected to the balancing of tourism issue in town, and that is a larger unaddressed issue of which tasting rooms are just a proxy of that issue. And so I think tasting rooms come down to a specific set of things, and after all the talk last time, it was came down to a use permit or not. And so I think last time the let's let the free market take care of it forces won. And then here we are, the city council has voted to have a moratorium on wine tasting. So I think that the writing's on the wall that it's time to have a use permit and let the forces of limitation get a crack at it here so that we can see that going forward, because that would balance out, you know, the voices in the community. I think that the tasting on the plaza is part of an internal wine industry struggle between the large winery model and the aggregate model in town. And so the in-town model, a lot of the money gets away from the city from the 8th Street East taxes, and so the plaza is ground zero for this internal issue. 2013 started to see negative effects. And 2014, Cook and Barbos on the city council arguing about regulation and what's onerous or not. And then, you know, us and them and the community, and you know, I think that it's going to be really useful in this discussion to define who the different cohorts in town are who are interested in this issue. So I think that you have your wine industry cohort, you have your wealthy locals, and you have your working locals. And so as far as a percentage of the demographic, it's shifting now. Sonoma is starting to become Carmelified, and a lot of the working class has had to move out since the last 5 years. So maybe they're just not here because they're just plain gone. But so I think that it's not us and them. There's 3 cohorts in town that have different interests in this, and that the Hidden in Plain Sight study and Sustainable Sonoma are pointing towards the working locals who are coming up on the short shrift of this issue of wine tourism and hospitality tourism. So it's not really a question of vilifying these guys. It's a question of balancing the town's interests here and the cohorts who are here. So as Commissioner Roberson said in the 414 meeting, use permits allow the public to have a voice. So I think that there's really not that, it's not that onerous, and David said that the use permit takes about 2 months if it goes good. So for the amount of time that I've put in studying and thinking about this, 3 minutes is grossly out of proportion for what I have to say on it, but I think that'll have to do for now because my time is up.
Thank you, Fred.
Tom Dunlap again. Having grown up here, one of the things that I appreciated as a youngster was the diversity of the business area in the plaza. was a great place to spend time, and there were probably, I think, 12 saloons on the plaza at that time, but there were also multiple businesses that were not food or alcohol related. Just like when, as an investor in the stock market or any type of investments, we're all instructed to diversify. And I think it's important that the Planning Commission, with having the ear of the City Council, think about that. The retail spaces that are available for other types of businesses. And I would just like you to consider that particular issue as you go forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing none, I'll close the public portion of this and we'll bring it back to the council for discussion and recommendations. Anybody want to start? I can tell you're not eager. Okay, Linda.
First of all, I want to qualify that I did speak to the City Council on this issue back in August, but it was more on diverse economics. But it had to do with tasting rooms, so I just want to qualify that. I want to start by saying that Sonoma is a wine town, and wine industry is very important. And reading the article about tourism, tourist-dependent small towns, we do have a brand, and it's a very successful brand, and it brings a lot of people to our town, and it makes our economy boom. So I think that is an important issue that we need to keep, but at the same time, I don't know how I feel about this issue. I'm still not decided. We are stewards of our community, and I believe very firmly that we need to control the tourism and that it does not need to control us. So balancing that with knowing that we're a wine industry town and that's who we are, I think those two issues need to be dealt with. And I'd like to get some more data. I think David's data was excellent, and I was really pleased to see that and his report. But I would like to go out to the businesses and talk to them and see how we can help them and what are their challenges and what can we do to make our economy more diverse. I think if we put too many eggs in one basket, if there is another recession, are we going to weather it? And as stewards of our community, I think we need to balance the businesses on the plaza. And when I say the plaza, the focus area is the plaza, and I see a huge opportunity on Broadway corridor. So having said that, I guess I'm leaning towards, I asked the question, what's the difference between a tavern and a wine tasting bar? And if the only difference is the type of alcohol they sell, in my opinion, alcohol is alcohol, and I really feel that these establishments need to be regulated. That's all I got to say.
Carol?
I have a few comments. I apologize to the commission and the public at large here for being green. To the use of regulating uses, where the regulation can affect something that really is in the marketplace in large part. I mean, if you really look at it, a lot of the uses that we've lost over the years, to my disappointment and many others, I'm sure pharmacies being one, okay, independent pharmacies and so forth, has a great deal more to do with the broader economic and market issues than it has anything to do with city regulations. And unfortunate or not, that is the case. I think government and regulations are like a couple of steps behind. They only represent about 10% of what you could do, number one. And secondly, they're a couple of steps behind where the market is going to go. So an overall regulation that's very restrictive or prohibitive on wine tasting, to me, would not represent or do us well at all. I think that wine tasting is why people come here. And in large part, it's very positive. The main issue, I think, that faces the city, and I believe this is the case, okay, is not whether or not we have wine tasting or whether we can control that market that doubled and may go back to less than half of what it is currently, again, because that happens in the market. If you think about these high rents that some people are paying, and that happens everywhere, where the rents go up when one use becomes very hot. Certainly restaurants is one of them in some cities. But it goes back down when the rent comes around, if you only have a 5-year lease and you can't afford to pay it anymore. And I've seen that happen enormously. And all of a sudden you're kind of cleaned out. So if you own your own building, you're in pretty good shape. If you have a long-term lease, you're in better shape than a short-term lease. But a short-term lease, you can get killed in the next go-around. And so that seems to be more self-correcting than a lot of regulations could actually accomplish. My feeling is that the biggest issue facing the wine tasting issue is indoor and outdoor use. I think the outdoor uses, and I agree with the gentleman who spoke on this issue, is that that can triple or quadruple the number of people that are there. Currently, there are no parking requirements for these wine tasting facilities. Parking certainly is at a premium in downtown Sonoma. And so the addition of that, and certainly by things like temporary structures like tents and canopies and outdoor heaters and so forth, really cooks up the kind of activity levels in some of these wine tasting facilities. I don't know how many of you go to Tahoe to ski in July, but let's face facts, you don't get to ski in July at Tahoe. Why would you want to be having a glass of wine, let's say in the middle of January of this year, okay, when it was cold and it was foggy and it was just not very pretty temperatures to be in? I think these are kind of seasonal uses. People come here when the weather is nice. They don't want to be here in the same droves that they do when the weather is not so nice. And I think that's just a part of the business that business, as well as any other, has to take into account. And those are my feelings.
Thank you. A question, Chair Felder. Where are we now in terms of our thrust? Are we into the specific recommendation area? Where are we now? I'm lost a little bit.
I think we're looking for as many comments, specific or general, that would help us guide them to drafting an ordinance.
Yeah, but sorry. Go ahead. I just was going to say that, this is a study session. It's your first opportunity to, get your feet wet in this issue and learn about this issue. So, we're certainly interested in hearing about kind of broad areas, but we're not expecting the commission to, again, make any kind of final policy decisions or directions. That will come later. We're interested in hearing about areas that you'd like us to study further. We're interested in hearing about regulatory options that you're interested in exploring, for sure.
Okay. So
I couldn't have said that any better. Thank you.
In terms of looking at
you
these,
probably, and I probably didn't say it as well as you. So,
in terms of looking at these city regulations that you've nicely outlined, Healdsburg, Carmel, and so forth, we're not really there to talk about comparing specific regulations, right? We're not there yet.
well, not quite, but we're going in a direction. But like, for example, one of the questions that I have is the sourcing requirement implemented? It seems kind of tricky to me. So if people are interested in a sourcing requirement, we'd have to study that further to see just what kind of success communities have had in managing that type of restriction.
Well, one thing one particular item is parking for me. I've looked into that carefully because of my experiences over the last couple of months and anticipating a couple of other projects coming up. I think the parking with the tasting rooms, particularly the outdoor, as I understand it, the outdoor seating is somewhat, has grown rampantly perhaps without regulation. Is that a safe thing to say?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, well,
No.
okay, I'll rest on that point. But I think the parking needs to be regulated very carefully because I think there's far more demand than perhaps meets the eye, both on the inside and particularly on the outside seating. And I briefly want to make a point about a parking survey that I personally did since I live on First Street West. If you take First Street West from Napa up to the depot and Spain Street on the north side of the square with the Swiss Hotel and the pizza place and the cheese factory, okay? Take all those seats inside and out and take all the parking that each of those facilities might provide, including the lot in the back. You come up with 1,133 seats. And if you apply the formula for inside and outside parking, just in a general way for restaurants, and you add all the parking, Steiner's has 10, Depot Park has 12, Waltz has 2, there's a couple of miscellaneous in back of the Swiss Hotel, you count the big parking lot. The net of that is there's 291 parking places short, assuming that the parking around the square and on the street are full from employees of the restaurants, which they are most of the time. And that's just I'm not a parking engineer because I don't speak Greek. So that perhaps needs to be looked at in a more professional way than Jim Bohar's amateur parking study. But I did walk through and talk to the managers of all those facilities, so these numbers are within 5 or 10%. That's a lot of spaces to be short on First Street West, 291. That means we should be looking a lot more carefully at the parking requirements for these facilities. Thank you.
Go ahead. Well, thank you, David, for a well-prepared report, and thank all of you in the audience who spoke. I want to follow up on a couple things that were mentioned by folks in the audience. First, just in terms to add my, here's more stuff I'd like to have the information on. Certainly what Mr. Barnett said about the missing tax opportunity. I mean, I'd really like to kind of understand that and how that works, because certainly that is always a consideration when you look at a use or a business or something. What's the cost-benefit kind of analysis? I know Mr. Allebach was curtailed a bit by his 3 minutes, but I did read through his correspondence to us, the other presentation he gave, and I may be misinterpreting this, but I think at the essence of, because I tried to kind of look this up and found multiple definitions of this notion of sustainable tourism, but I think my takeaway from reading his piece and hearing him speak, and then the other reading I did, is kind of the crux of what some people have concern about as a missing piece in our equation, is the, fair wages, living wage, and things that are provided by the industry workers who support the tourism. Because I think, I kind of looked at the, it's low impact on the culture and the environment. It seems like, by and large, this industry, other than water usage, but there's more and more people going towards sustainable ag with the wine, and I know that's the direction that Sonoma's going overall. And I think it is fundamentally an agricultural use, whether it's the tasting of the product or the production of the product. And it certainly creates a positive experience for the visitor. And so I think the piece there, so I'd like to understand, and I don't know if we can do some outreach to what extent the folks in the industry can provide us with sort of their data that they have about their wage base and benefits and those kinds of things. I did my own little sort of survey, the things that I wanted to kind of drill deeper on, and I just kind of picked on 3 tasting facilities in so doing, but these are things that I'd like to see us pursue, I think would be good to know, and we've kind of talked about some of them. Ownership, you know, who's the owners of these things? Of the 3 I visited, and this was just kind of a random selection, one was owned by a husband and a wife, the other was just identified as a local person, and another one was identified as someone who is a part-time resident of Sonoma, part-time resident of San Francisco. One had 1 part-time employee besides the husband and wife. The other one had 1 employee, and another one had 45 employees. So kind of what's the employment base of these establishments? And I went to the grape sourcing. One was 100% local. Some didn't really have any data, but said some in, some out of the valley. And the others was about 90+%. So I think if we can, you know, get that level of detail. Also, I looked at the number, you know, who uses these facilities. You know, a phrase that was spoken several times this evening and we hear quite often is this notion of balance between visitors and locals. And so I kind of asked, all right, in your tasting facility, what's your balance? It went anywhere from 25, depending upon which, you know, but again, I think if we could get those numbers for each of the tastes, because, I mean, these are not just, in my mind, they're not just facilities for tourists, they're also resources for locals as well. And then finally, where's the production done? And of the 3 I visited, 2, the production was done here in the Valley, and 1, the production was done in Napa, though they said they were looking for facilities in Sonoma. So I think it'd be kind of important to understand, again, the total economic picture, because, you know, obviously from what I've read and from what you provided, you know, this new model of wine entrepreneurship, it's not largely big wineries. It's a lot of small entrepreneurial kind of operations. And I think if we can understand what our balance is, you know, do we have mostly that? And it also might inform any kind of regulations that we might want to put around that. The other area where I'd like to see a little more data, first I have to give a nod to Commissioner Barnett for causing me to have flashbacks to my stat class in college and tea tables, reading the academic papers that he shared with us. But there was a line from one of those that it talked about downtowns that are part of tourism communities are less dependent on their mix of businesses or the presence of magnet stores than they are on their brand image of the tourist destination. And so around this issue of diversity, I mean, we've talked about it here. You mentioned it. Others have mentioned it. You know, most people point to Amazon, but it's not just Amazon. I mean, in general, online retail has been eating away at brick and mortar retail, and in a significant way. But also, there's been a cultural shift, particularly amongst millennials, but also some shifting attitudes amongst boomers and others about getting away from material purchases towards experiential purchases. And when I looked at the data from the last time this issue was discussed till now, we had 2 major areas that went down in terms of occupancy on the plaza. Retail was down by 6%. The personal services were down 5% for a total of 11%. The 2 biggest gains were restaurants up 4 and wine tasting up 7. So an offset, and reflecting what sounds like is just a general trend in shifting from material to experiential, food and wine. In fact, there was an article in the Atlantic from last year, and it talked about in the period since 2005, the growth in the food and beverage segment of the economy has more than doubled the growth in the retail. And so what I kind of want to understand is what are we seeing an anomaly here, or are we just simply seeing something that's, so how can we get some data with comparable communities or whatever and say, is this just really something that everybody is experiencing, or is it really unique to Sonoma? And just my initial suggestion is that it appears to be part of a larger trend, and I don't know how much we might be off or on that trend. And then finally, Mr. Dunlap said that these potentially these tasting rooms are occupying spaces that could be available for other types of businesses, and then that's my question. There is if not tasting rooms, then what? Rather than being reactionary, shouldn't we be visionary? And I don't know if it's maybe from the Economic and Business Development Services, or bring in some resources. I don't know what's being done. Is there anything being done to say we want to attract, if this is not the ideal mix in our plaza, then what does the ideal mix look like? And what are we doing to create that ideal mix? Because I think in very broad terms, is this a carrot or a stick kind of, and I tend to lead more with the carrot than the stick sort of approach, and say, well, should we, rather than be clamping down on something, hitting it with a stick, should we not be holding a carrot out in front of something else to say, bring this on if we really want to, if we determine that the mix is wrong. So what are we doing in a proactive way to create other business opportunities or attract other types? If this is the wrong type of business for us, then what is the right type of business? So I don't know if the chamber or the economic, if we have any data like that, or if there's somebody that could provide us that, but that's certainly something that I think would be informative to our decision-making process. Because I think we have examples of successful retail in town, and maybe there's something about them that we can replicate or create. But those are just my general, I don't know what you can do with all that, but hopefully.
We'll do our best. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, did you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you again for a great staff report, David, and for the public for coming out. I think this is a very important issue, and I think that's recognized by the fact that we're here 5 years later, as Larry Barnett said, and we're still here. This is still an important issue. And I think Mr. Allebach brought up a good point. I think tasting rooms are being used as a sort of proxy for a discussion I think our community needs to have about tourism, and whether it's sustainable tourism, as Commissioner Cribb just referenced, or something else. I think that these balance between tourists and visitors and residents is sort of out of whack, and I think that's the issue. And I think fairly or unfairly, people are using tasting rooms as the opportunity to discuss that and have that community conversation. So to the extent we can have a broader, intelligent discussion about tourism and the benefits and the costs that come associated with that, I think that would be important for this community to have. And I was reading an article over the weekend about this sort of concept, and the title of the article was "Sonoma's No Sleeper, a Tourism Insomnia Has Locals Worried." And it said that Sonoma has always drawn tourists, but where they once came for the waters from nearby mineral baths and springs, they now come for the wine. Hotels are proposed, and not everyone is thrilled. Locals say they avoid downtown on the weekend. The owner of the Swiss Hotel is concerned growth will change Sonoma's identity of a quaint little town. And a former mayor and city councilman is complaining his town is becoming another Carmel. And if it does, it will drive businesses like ours out of here. And he chastised the city for trying to please the tourists and not the residents. And this article was not a recent article. It was from 1984. in the Press Democrat. The owner of the Swiss Hotel then was Helen Dunlap. The former city council member and mayor who's complaining about tourists was not Larry Barnett, but August Pinelli. And I think that that sort of teaches us that this is an important issue. We've gotten it right before, and the fact that we're still talking about these issues shows how important Sonoma is, but also that perhaps the balance is a little off right now. And so the fact that we are having this discussion, I think, is a good thing. We had this discussion back in 2013, and it's just gotten better or worse, depending on your view of the situation. Just a personal anecdote, I was at a wedding last year in July down in Palo Alto, Los Altos area, and I was just meeting people at the wedding, and they asked where I was from, and I said Sonoma, and they said, "Oh, we love Sonoma. We just, love your square." And after I corrected them and said it's actually a plaza, I asked how they liked Sonoma and how did you like your visit to the area, and she said, well, there just seemed like there were a lot of tasting rooms. There were just how many different tasting rooms can you go to? Like Healdsburg has this, or Yountville has this, or St. Helena has this. Like you might want to tone back your tasting rooms. And so I told her she was wrong because, within a family, you sort of defend your family when someone else is attacking it. But, it made me think maybe we have a problem and maybe we should have this discussion. I think Commissioner Corrado said earlier that we have to be good stewards of Sonoma, and I think having this discussion is part of that. I think to some extent, the fact that we didn't do something 5 years ago, I worried we may have failed our residents, and quite frankly, I think we may have failed our tourists, because this person I spoke to, and again, it's an anecdote, but I think it's representative of something that I've heard a lot of people say. Tourists, especially millennials that we talk about that want these sort of experiential experiences, millennials also crave authenticity. And I think what this 1984 article highlighted about Sonoma was how authentic it was. And it compared it actually in 1984 to Napa and basically explained the sort of differences. And the more we go away from that, the less authentic we become and the less attractive we become to this growing millennial generation. And so, again, these are important conversations to have. I mean, when I hear Healdsburg and Calistoga and Carmel, of all places, have regulations, I'm sort of embarrassed that we haven't done this yet, to be quite honest. And I worry that, again, we may have, in the last 5 years, failed this situation, both residents and tourists. I want to talk about the free market briefly. I love the free market. We don't need to get political here, but I'm generally a huge fan of the free market. But I don't think this is a free market issue. This is a zoning issue. And when it comes to land use and zoning, we don't have a free market. We don't have a free market when it comes to residential zoning. I would love to put an Airbnb in my house. I can't. There are restrictions in residential zoning. We have restrictions when it comes to commercial zoning and I'd like to back up. I do not want to put an Airbnb in my house. So what I'm saying is that we have restrictions. We have restrictions when it comes to commercial zoning. We can't have a Starbucks on the plaza due to this formula retail ordinance. Other elements that have use permits. This is a normal conversation to have, and it should not be a free market versus alternatives. This is not what the discussion should be. When it comes to wine economics, I'm interested in learning more about the change in the wine industry over the last 10 years, and that was highlighted in the staff report, and how that's affected this land use decision and discussion on the plaza. From what I understand, and I'm sure people know this better than I do, but per the custom crush model, you don't need a vineyard. You don't have this sort of historic. I mean, in this article, it talked about how Sonoma had 13 wineries, and we may have 13 tasting rooms on First Street East right now. But back then, a winery was acreage and grapes and an old winery, and now you can buy grapes from a vineyard and rent space on 8th Street East and slap your label on there, and then open up a spot on the plaza. And while I think it's important to understand how that change in the wine industry is affecting the pressures on the plaza, I don't think it's relevant to our decision. I mean, I don't think it's relevant to land use and zoning decision. I think it would be irresponsible to give away our town center to just one industry because their economic model has changed. And so I think we need to know about it. But ultimately, if our goal is to create through land use policies, a plaza that has a diverse group of businesses and experiences for all people that will delight locals and make them proud, and also delight tourists and make them want to come back, I don't think that's a relevant point. I also think this is a pro-regulating. There's also, beyond the free market discussion, there's a discussion in town that bothers me, that any regulation is anti-business. And I tend to be someone who, I like to view myself as very pro-business, and I think regulating tasting rooms will be a pro-business move for Sonoma. I say that for a variety of reasons. We need to ensure that locals that want to start small businesses and be able to appeal to locals and tourists on the plaza have opportunities. And if this economic model that I just discussed continues to just run away, they will have fewer and fewer opportunities to do that. And it will make a monoculture on the plaza, and I don't think locals will like that, and I don't think tourists would like that. And this sort of goes into my next point in terms of just how we market Sonoma. I think, there has been an effort to sort of double down on our wine tourism, and I think wine tourism is a very important part of how we should market Sonoma, but Healdsburg does that, and St. Helena does that, and Calistoga to some extent does that, and Yountville does that, and so I'm trying to think of what are our competitive advantages. And I think our competitive advantages from a marketing perspective, I mean, we already have the wine, but it's history, it's authenticity, it's all these other things that we kill St. Helena, and especially Healdsburg, and all these other places on. And so we should really be focusing on that. And that's not anti-wine. The wine industry is a critical and valued and cherished industry in Sonoma. But, to the extent that we can foster other industries like agritourism, and, we used to have a huge dairy industry here, and Petaluma had poultry, and the San Giacomos had much more than wine. They had every different kind of tree you could grow on that property. To the extent that we can sort of show how we're more authentic and different and better than the other places, including wine, I think that would be a good way to go. And so if that can be part of a broader community conversation, I think this would be a good opportunity to have that. So ultimately, when we're talking about going forward in terms of specific recommendations, I mean, as I said, I think regulations are good I think this is actually going to help our local wine industry, especially when it comes to local sourcing requirements. I think it's pro-business. I think it's pro-resident. I think it's a tourist economy. It will enable us to compete in a better, more sustainable, more diverse way than our local competitors. I think this is a win-win. I think in terms of the specific recommendations, I think we should have absolutely a local grape requirement. I have no idea how you would regulate that. And as David many times has said, we are a complaint-driven planning regulation system. And so I would have no idea how we do that. But in terms of the general spirit of having local grapes, I would say absolutely.
Well, it could be a reporting requirement. I mean, I'm not,
Yeah,
again, I'm not trying to put out things that say that things are impossible. I just am not, we still have to study how it's done, that's all.
I'm not a vintner, and I know there are a lot of blends, and you can get grapes from here and all over the place, and I don't know how, I don't know how that's all regulated, but I do think we definitely need to have local grapes. Because I know, I mean, I'm not going to pick out different tasting rooms, but there are many tasting rooms. Or I read a newspaper article last year that a few tasting rooms came to Sonoma because they couldn't go to Healdsburg, and they couldn't go elsewhere, and they were blocked out, and so they came here, and that did not make me happy. It was embarrassing. In terms of use permit versus, you know, I absolutely think there should be a use permit. I'm wondering if the only thing that bothers me about a use permit is how it runs with the land, and if that's tied in with a cap, which I don't know if that's even being discussed, but if we talk about a cap, we're going to have sort of like a pre-Uber New York City taxi medallion situation where, you know, we're going to overinflate the use of these use permits because you can only have 30. And I don't want, I mean, there are unintended consequences we don't want to deal with. And so I'm wondering if there's another regulation, like, for example, business licenses, like a conditional business license that
Well,
does not run with the land.
I think that that's something that we would like to explore as well, because the use permit just creates a kind of a self-perpetuating situation where you have this value that's associated with this spot, and so that it never goes away. It's sort of like vacation rentals. They just never go away once they're there. So I don't know for sure if that's going to be a viable option, but it's definitely something we would like to look at.
I would love to really drill down on that because while I support use permits, I just don't want to create a situation where those unintended consequences, it could just become problematic. And so that sort of leads into my final point, and I sort of brought it up during my questions. Just in terms of the timeline, I think it's I mean, I'm all for let's doing, you know, as long as we really sort of drill down and explore all these issues and really reach out to the community and reach out to the wine industry, obviously, and reach out, you know, even bring in, you know, those academic papers that James was referencing. You know, this isn't the only place in the world that stuff like this has happened. I mean, they have focused on tourism in small towns and how residents are both benefited and negatively affected, and how, you know, there are ways to look at this. And so, while the only sort of issue layered in about where you know, what the balance is. I mean, you know, when I was I think I was 14, I started because I knew the Viviani law, and I mean, you know, and I was 3 years old when this article came out. I have never known Sonoma not to have tourism. I am not anti-tourism. I love visitors to our town. I'm very proud of it. But there is a balance issue. I mean, when I used to work at the cheese factory, we would have, it's just different. It's different now. And so if that's what the town, by the way, if that's what the town wants, if that's what Sonoma wants, then that's what we should have. I just don't think that's what Sonoma wants. And I think they want to sort of restore some balance to the plaza and really maintain diversity that not only you know, will keep them coming to the plaza, their plaza, but will also sort of you know, create a better destination for our tourists. And so, again, if there's any, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, but if we can use this tasting room discussion to sort of have a broader discussion, and ultimately, I don't think we'll ever fix it, because obviously, you know, this comes up every 10 years, but you know, going forward, it'd be great if we really had a good foundation to sort of move forward on.
Well, it's a recurring conversation because things change. The economy changes, the town changes, and people, but the thing that stays constant, at least with respect to Sonoma, is that there's a lot of local interest in the downtown. And people really value it, and they want it to be, you know, a part of their experience as residents. So It's very important to have this conversation, and it's not a conversation that, like you say, will ever be solved. It's something that will always happen. Now, as you said, I think it's quite true that this discussion is sort of a proxy for some larger issues. And it's inevitable that that's going to be part of the discussion of updated regulations on wine tasting. But that said, I don't think that that necessarily needs to be, I don't think that this really can be a vehicle for that larger discussion. But the good news is that the council has, expressed interest in allocated funding as part of an upcoming general plan update for a developing an economic strategic plan. And so that would be the true vehicle for that discussion. And that's going to be forthcoming, I believe, later this year.
Okay. Thank you.
I guess I'll take a shot next. I wanted to thank everybody in the audience for participating in this study session and the wonderful comments from the commissioners. I also really appreciate the staff report that you prepared, David, because it was very concise and was very helpful and helped us focus on a lot of issues that I didn't even think about.
Well, I do need to say for the record, the city manager wrote all the good parts. So.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the city's effort in the staff report. It's just very helpful. I don't want to belabor the previous comments that my fellow commissioners have already provided, particularly Commissioner Cribb, Jansen, and Barnett. And you each touched on the very things that I also was concerned about and focused on, and I don't want to belabor that point. I do want to make a general a statement. I think balance is very important in any sort of community and business climate. And the concerns of people, I read the paper and I listen to the people on the street. And more importantly, I'm in the hospitality business. I deal with people that come to Sonoma from all over the world and all over this country. I meet people from Australia, from Europe, from Asia, from the East Coast, the Midwest, and from Canada, and even from the Americas. So, and I really always engage and ask folks, how did you enjoy your stay? How did you like Sonoma? And I've been doing this since 2004. So, and I have to tell you, I have had some comments from people, particularly about the tasting rooms. And I have to admit, people said, well, I think that there's probably too many wine tasting rooms on the plaza. There's not enough restaurants. There's not enough other things to engage somebody that staying at my vacation rental business and they want to do something other than just taste wine. So I just wanted to throw that out as it relates to balance, and particularly Commissioner Barnett's comments about perceptions of Sonoma and why people from Australia and Canada and New Jersey, why they come to Sonoma versus staying in Napa or staying in San Luis Obispo County or in Santa Barbara County. What brings them here and gets them to come back again? Because I have people that come to my business year after year because they love Sonoma. They love Sonoma, and these are the very people that have also commented saying, there's like a lot of tasting rooms on the plaza now. So I just wanted to throw that out, as I'm not a survey. I'm just a commissioner that's listening to this from my own customers. So I think to just focus on that point, I think it would be really helpful for the Chamber of Commerce to actually prepare a survey from our visitors to get a better sense of what people are really experiencing in Sonoma, some of the things that are really attracting them, but also some of the things that they, food for thought. Maybe there are too many tasting rooms. This also gets to what David had commented about the general plan. Our vision for 2020, I can't remember when that was done, 2004, is a well-balanced community that looks at a tourist-based economy, but also balances that with creating a wonderful living environment for the people that live here. And if you take a look at the language within our general plan, there are, I can't tell you how many times, wine tasting, vacation rentals. These are all uses that our general plan encourages to create a tourist-based economy that is steeped in the history of Sonoma Valley. Hotels, all those sorts of things, those specific uses that come out. And so I'm really glad to hear that there is going to be an economic strategic plan developed as part of our general plan update, because this does help us address that larger issue, is like, where are we going to now, and what are we going to become, and what our new mission statement is going to be for the city, and that guides our business and economic climate for our city. I had focused also, and I talked a little bit about, what are some of the obstacles and restrictions that maybe perhaps prohibit uses that might otherwise be located on the plaza, but they have been discouraged to be here. And one particular use comes to my mind. It has to do with my friend's business that used to exist on the plaza and had been here for almost 15 years with a long-term lease, and they sold furniture, Harvest Home. And they existed happily here on the plaza. Not only that, but they also encouraged local locals to build recycled furniture. And I loved that place. And I bought every single stick of furniture in my house from that store. And I was trying to keep my money in my community. Knowing that their lease expired and they could not afford that rent, they had to go elsewhere and build something outside of the city limits, still trying to be as close to Sonoma as possible, but they're not in the city of Sonoma anymore. So what caused that? Why did their rent go up so much that they were not able to renegotiate their lease? Because they could not afford to be in the city of Sonoma on the plaza. They probably would have still been here if they could not afford to stay on the plaza. So I need to understand what causes that, and if the rents, we had talked about a rent survey, so it's very important to understand the differences in rent and what the long-term leases that exist on the plaza versus the short-term leases, and how that may change the complexion of the plaza if we don't have any use permit or restrictions in place as it is right now. And so that's my concern, is that if we do nothing and we have no use permit, we don't have any sort of restriction or gauge, if we look at all of the leases and ownership of the properties on the plaza, where will the retail uses that we're seeing, that big, healthy 39% chunk, will that start shrinking? Because when these long-term leases like Harvest Home expire, will you see big retailers leave the plaza? Or those that have like a huge retail presence that actually generate a lot of sales tax for the city. So I'm really interested in looking at those complex issues. Some of other commissioners focused on if we were to have a use permit in process in place. I think that's very important because, and I'm going to focus on one particular thing. It has to do with the indoor versus outdoor use of these tasting rooms. And I have to admit that some of the tasting rooms that have come in to the city of Sonoma have changed the streetscape. And I'm not saying it's for the worst. Some of these are in commercial zones, and so you want to engage the public. You want to engage the pedestrian on the street and show activity, because that's the sign of a healthy downtown. But then again, the line is drawn where you say, for example, we're on the Design Review Commission, you approve a beautiful patio out in front of a wine tasting room, and then a bubble tent goes up and is there for 6 months out of the year, and the whole property is engaged with Christmas lights for the whole year. Is that what we want in Sonoma? And right now, we don't have any way of controlling that because we don't have any special standards. So those are the sorts of things that I'd like to see, in addition to the other questions that I had about the point of sales and sales tax. But I really think that we need to really look at why some businesses are leaving because they can't afford to be here. A monoculture is not healthy. It's not healthy in a biological community. You could have a complete pine forest, where it's evolved to a pine forest, and then one catastrophic event kills all the pines, and you lose all the diversity and all the insects and all the other plant habitat that feed off of a more diverse plant community. And even in biology, a monoculture is not ideal because it is very fragile. So, thanks.
Commissioner Lander, would you like to chime in?
Sure. As my fellow commissioners have stated, this is not an easy issue or something that can be taken lightly because there are a lot of ramifications. I do not believe that the wine tasting facilities are necessarily bad in and of themselves, but too much of anything, I think, can be bad. I believe that the overarching concern that I have is broader than wine tasting rooms, and that is, how do we maintain a healthy and diverse downtown plaza area? One of the things that came out of the 2008 recession was some empty spaces, and oftentimes they're referred to as see-throughs. And as a resident of Sonoma, it does bother me when I walk by a commercial building or a retail space and it is empty. It just, to me, sends the wrong message. So one of my goals would be, how can we promote this kind of diversity around the plaza without excess regulation? But how do we encourage to have many different businesses on the plaza? I would love to find out, and I'm not sure if this is something we can, David, but I know that when it comes to wine tasting, on the corner where now Pangloss is currently there, and you mentioned it, there was more of a co-op tasting room. I do support the small winery concepts. I would be disappointed, like our small family farms are disappearing to corporate farms. I would hate to see all of our small family wineries, but I'd be curious to know if there is any more viability in the concept of a co-op. I did talk to one of the tenants there, and she was not real clear as far as the pluses and the minuses. I loved the comment about the quality of Sonoma as far as being an authentic town, and that is very appealing to me. I almost like to twist the phrase and say, I want to be a town of integrity and be something real. I also am concerned about creating a regulation such as a use permit that does run with the land, because I think that's dangerous, particularly for a very special area around the plaza. So I'm glad that this is just the beginning of the process of review. There's a lot more that we received late in terms of some information that I'm anxious to get back into. So I am pretty open right now as far as my mindset, as far as how we move forward, but I share the concern about maintaining the health of our plaza.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank the public that came out tonight and gave us some meaningful input, and I'm hoping that in future sessions that we will have a larger audience as well, because this is an important issue. I also want to thank the commissioners up here. I think some very good points were made, some very good insight was provided. If I had to sum it up, I think that there is at least some amount of consensus that we need to move forward with additional regulation to try to keep things under control. There is a sense that we need some balance and some diversity in our, especially in our plaza. And the way that we set ourselves apart is that we are authentic, and we do provide the integrity of a historical base in this town. So I'm looking forward to moving forward with some suggested regulations and ways to attack this problem. And I think, David, you've gotten some very good input from the commission, so hopefully that's enough to let you go forward.
I got some great input. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So I think we'll conclude this agenda item, and we will move on to the last item on the agenda right now. Is just an update on development activity, which I will turn over to Mr. Goodison.
Well, we often see projects in isolation. That's how we usually see them. And I think it's good to step back from time to time and take a look at the big picture, especially when there's so much going on that is either before you now or headed your way. So just a quick look at where things stand today in Sonoma as far as our housing stock. 5,658 units as of January 1st of 2017. The numbers typically come out in May and June, so we don't have them any earlier, any later than that. Sonoma is primarily single-family detached. That has been true forever. But there's definitely some diversity there between mobile homes and attached structures as well. Before we get into what's going on today, let's take a look back. And the time frame that I'm going to be using is the 2007 to 2014 housing element planning period objectives. So every so often, the state of California, through the Department of Housing and Community Development, assigns housing objectives to every jurisdiction in California, tailored to that jurisdiction. When that happens, cities and counties have to update their general plan housing elements to see that those objectives are addressed or can at least be accommodated in terms of available land. So we're in a new period now, but the preceding period was this 2007 through 2014 planning period in terms of housing needs. And you can see that over that planning period, just in total, Sonoma built less than half of its housing objective, at least as it was defined by the Department of Housing and Community Development. Now, you can certainly argue that their objective isn't necessarily Sonoma's objective, but it is a way of looking, you know, it's a lens. It provides a way of looking at things in a particular context. And in fact, let's see. I meant to write this down, but 169 divided by 8, that's 21 units per year during that period of time. Now, one thing that obviously happened is that just about as soon as this objective was assigned, California went into a recession. So that really occurred in 2007. So we've got some projects in the pipeline that are built in 2007 and 2008, but after that it falls off pretty dramatically. And in 2013, the main thing that happened was that we built some affordable housing. So that was a city project or city redevelopment project. That was the Sonoma Valley Oaks project off of Sonoma Highway. So that was responsible for, the majority of what occurred that year. But you can see that in 2014, it appears that maybe things are beginning to pick back up. It's important to remember that housing development takes money and time, and money takes time. It takes time to put together the financing for a housing project of any size, and then it takes time to go through the planning process, and then you have to build the thing. So, we're certainly out of the recession now, but in recent years, we haven't seen that much housing activity in terms of permits issued. And so that's something I probably should have mentioned to begin with. We're looking at permits issued in these tables. So in 2015, we issued 11, permits finaled. We finaled 11 housing units in 2015. We finaled 16 in 2016 and 10 in 2017. Those obviously are not big numbers, but we are out of the recession, and that activity is occurring, and it's coming forward now. So now we have a lot of different things in the pipeline. Some of this is old, and some of it's not even applied for yet. So starting from the top, some of the older stuff, the Giannis mixed-use apartments off of Sonoma Highway are under construction. Nacora Place on Spain Street is under construction. Mission Square is going to break ground shortly. The Marino Hotel is under construction, or at least portions of it. We also have some approved projects that are relatively substantial by local standards. Back in, I believe it was October, the Planning Commission, no, it must have been September, excuse me. The Planning Commission approved the 30-unit Oliva Apartments on Spain Street, and the Commission in November approved the Altamira Apartments project on Broadway. Although that was appealed, the City Council denied the appeal and has directed that the project be approved. In terms of things that are under review, the West Napa Hotel is currently still under review. There's a 14-unit project on Sonoma Highway that is undergoing environmental review, the Sonoma Cheese Factory renovation, and the Gateway mixed-use project at 870 Broadway. And then in the pre-application, you held a study session recently on what's now called the Athena subdivision. We're all hoping that the name changes. Off of West MacArthur Street, that's the hospital lot. And also in the early stages is a project called Vintage Park, which would encompass the parcels, the Peterson property parcels off of First Street East. So that project isn't fully described on this chart. It does include an apartment component that right now is penciled in at 27 units, but it also includes a senior care facility. So what does that look like when you add it up? Well, first here's the map that just shows where these different things are occurring. But again, what happens when we start adding it up? Well, in terms of the affordability mix, and this is including everything, so it's not to count chickens before they've hatched, but it's just to show you what is in front of you now. We're looking at a pretty good range of affordability. And I think that's actually captured better in this next set of charts. So first, in the distribution of unit types, 2/3 are apartments. That's pretty significant. In terms of the projected mix of affordability, 60% are above are market rate units, so they're not affordability restricted, but that's not a bad percentage, and we've got a pretty good mix of affordability at the other levels. In terms of the distribution of unit sizes, 40% are less than 1,250 square feet in area. Only 6% are greater than 2,000 square feet in area. And in terms of the balance of uses that you're looking at, this is in terms of square feet, 80% residential, 20% commercial. Moving forward, if these things come true in a broad sense, which obviously we don't know for sure, we are in the process of making pretty good progress in terms of meeting our current regional housing needs allocation. So our current allocation planning period is 2015 through 2023. We've approved 38 extremely low and very low income units in the Altamira project, and another 9 units at the low income level. In the pre-application stage, we've got more additional low income units, as well as a number of moderate income units coming forward. So obviously, these are projects that are under review in many cases. And the balance of affordability, the balance of unit sizes, the number of units, all of that's subject to change. But this is what things are looking like as they're before us today.
I have a question. It has to do with moving forward and today's political climate and federal funding that helps support subsidized projects and nonprofits, and the tax shelters that once were available may not necessarily be available moving forward based on the current regime. I mean, the political, the current administration.
Yeah.
How does this affect, for example, the Altamira project, and then looking forward at any other developer that wanted to come in and try to get tax credits for building affordable housing?
Well, it's not good, I'll tell you that. It's just as you said, just based on changes that were made in the overhaul of tax regulations, tax credit financing for affordable housing isn't nearly as attractive as it used to be. So that's the bad news for that form of financing. And it is bad news because that is the primary form of financing that has been used in the past to develop units at the extremely low and very low income levels, especially with redevelopment gone. That said, in its 2017 session, the California state legislature adopted a number of measures that are intended to generate additional revenue for affordable housing. So those are pieces that are being put into place. That money hasn't started to flow yet, but at least the state is looking at the state level, trying to find different sources of revenue for that type of project.
Okay, thanks.
Linda?
This is just for information. I just attended a workshop with the County Board of Supervisors on housing. There's a mandate to have 30,000 homes in Sonoma County. Where they're going to put them, How they're going to do it, I don't know, but there's 30,000.
Well, we want to treat this like any other item. I mean, this is question time, and then we'll open it up for public comment and then commission comment, correct?
That's correct. So if there are any questions of the staff report, we'll open it up to public if you'd like to make any comments.
Fred Allbach, again, 8th Street East. I'm kind of like somebody who just took off weight, so now that I get 3 minutes of all these fun things to comment on, I think the low-income housing tax credits, California is going to lose $500 million on that right off the bat as far as where the disincentivizing of that. I'm curious about the zoning and use permit and land use. I know that in cities, zoning is a way that has focused certain land uses across the country to create communities of certain compositions. And so I'm curious if there's any books, David, that you would recommend that I could read where I could find out about zoning and you know, like I had thought that a use permit was something, okay, that's something that the government here can use to control the use, but if it goes with the land, then that almost doesn't make sense, because then every plaza business, whoever got one, would only have to be that. Or maybe a business can have like 5 use permits on the same land, so if they want to be a skating rink and then a wine tasting, it all just depends on what's selling at that time of the economy. But I'd just be curious to know, as to being an educated citizen, you know, how I might find out about, you know, to make some more intelligent comments about land use and you know, we're talking about balancing and you know, maybe molding the authentic character of our city and not let it be taken away by forces that are inauthentic. And so how can zoning and land use, you know, serve that? I'm just curious.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks, Fred. I'd be happy to follow up with you on that later on, okay?
Hi, Tom Conlon again. I just wanted to say thank you, David, for compiling all that amazing data. If I'm keeping track, I think the 2007 through 2014 RHNA, that had a deficit of 169. So if all those projects get built, we'd have a surplus of 119. So we're still behind. But we're a lot better off than we would be if those projects don't get built. So just keeping that, I think that's correct interpretation.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say that, if anyone heard me say problem solved, I do not mean to say problem solved.
No, I was just...
I want to say where things are, and I would like to say that I believe that we are making positive progress.
And that was my point, was that I looked at that, I got excited, and then I went back and looked at that other slide, and I just did the math just as I got to the podium. So Linda mentioned the 30,000 units they're talking about at the county level. There's a lot of people who have concerns about whether that's just a number that's being arbitrarily talked about right now. I don't see how the greenhouse gas can be managed cost effectively to build that many units in a short period of time and still meet our SB 32 goals. That's just my personal one small slice of this issue. It's a lot of issues to talk about with meeting these housing and rebuilding needs. But, you know, kudos to everybody who's doing everything they can right now. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Bring it back to the commission. So, you're looking for any other comments from the commission on this, David, or?
This is just an information item. Like I say, when we look at one project or another, as we continue to do that, and I think it's just important to have the bigger picture in mind in terms of of other things that are going on, because, you know, we've said this before in other contexts, no one project is going to solve every problem or meet every need. We need to do it piece by piece, typically, to address the wide variety of needs that exist in this town.
ahead, Linda.
Came out, they can't find builders. So they have this need for all these homes, and the contractors can't find builders.
They can't find builders and they can't find money, but it's going to happen, right? I think, does that pretty much cover your issues update as well?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so then I'm going to open it up to comments from the commission.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Of course.
On this. This just sort of, it's interesting, we just had a long agenda item about regulating commercial businesses and rents would come up, and you know, obviously there's sort of a view like free market, et cetera. But then we look at this and it's completely reversed. Has there any community ever approached their commercial districts in a similar way that we approach residential affordable opportunities, meaning like giving small business owners affordable opportunities in certain districts, as we do with residences?
Well, I believe that the only example that I can think of that comes remotely close is actually, I believe, Beverly Hills, because they own quite a large number of commercial properties. So they can set their own rent, and they can look for the tenants that they look for, and get the mix that they want because they're the property owner. But I'm not aware, but that's the only thing that's coming to my mind, Kelso. Sorry,
Right.
Commissioner Barnett. I could certainly look around and see about
I'm just
other
curious,
examples.
and I'm not even saying I think it's a good
Yeah,
idea.
yeah.
I'm just curious. Thank you.
We're into commissioner comments.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation, David, and it was enlightening. I wanted to make one comment. I think that I'm looking at these pie charts. This is kind of reflective of what our commission has been trying to move forward and seeing these types of changes, and so it's good to see kind of like a summary. I also want to compliment staff because before projects come before us, there is lots of discussion, providing feedback to people that are interested in developing properties, and giving them the reality check of, like, you know, if you really want something to happen, this is kind of how it's going to have to be. It might not necessarily be what you want, and I think that this information shows that, you know, we've moved forward both with the staff and with the commission and trying to get a better mix of housing in the city for these new projects. So I'm going to thank you on that. And just to follow up on the comment that Commissioner Barnett made about you know, ways to go ahead and possibly make change with uses. You know, some cities, and I don't think we've ever discussed this in the city of Sonoma, but there are some cities actually fine landowners that leave their properties vacant, and they give them a certain amount of time to find a tenant. If not, there's a penalty, and they're actually charged a fine. And a good example would be a lot of the property owners that they own their property outright, and so they're not necessarily wanting to possibly make a profit, because if they show a loss, that's okay too, because they could write it off. So sometimes you'll see property owners just leave storefront vacant until they find that golden egg that comes in, will associate a long-term lease or a short-term lease, basically 2, 3, 4 times the amount that normally another use might have gone in and paid for. And so there's a disincentive to allow property owners to sit and hold property for a year, 2 years, waiting for that particular use that will come in and pay top dollar. And in the meantime, our community suffers and we have vacant storefronts. So just to follow up on your comment, Commissioner Barnett, there are ways that we could as a city create a diverse mix of use, residential or commercial, by basically fining property owners for underutilizing their property. So.
Anyone else?
My one comment when I review the proposed projects in the pipeline and what we're seeking to accomplish, I'm reminded of the fact that change is inevitable. And what I like is it looks like we are moving forward with thoughtful change, and I think that's one big step toward kind of keeping Sonoma authentic. So I think that's good.
What is the, there's a growth management ordinance, right? So how many
Correct.
units are even allowed per year?
The growth management ordinance seeks to set, and I know this is a terrible phrase, a maximum average of something like 60, I think it's at 67 units per year. But within any given year, it can be more. Most years, it's a lot less.
David, I had asked you earlier that at some point I'd like to have you give us kind of a roadmap or a timeline on where we go with update to the general plan and when we might expect to see various phases of that come before us.
Well, we're going to be going to the City Council on that subject this spring to get some additional direction from them in terms of what they would like to see, and as soon as that happens, we'll be back in front of the Planning Commission.
Sounds good. Anybody else have any additional things? Otherwise, I'm going to call for a motion to adjourn. Oh, Linda, one last chance, huh?
There are a couple of issues that I would like us to discuss in a public forum, and I'm sure that other commissioners have issues that they'd like to discuss. And I was hoping that we could put a workshop agenda together for us when we have a light evening like this, so that we could each take a topic and discuss it and then see if we want to take it forward as a group. And for instance, I've got two issues, and one dovetails into Commissioner McDonald's comment, and I would like to see like a tax on an extra tax on homes that are not being used as a primary residence, not a vacation rental, but they are renting them out, and they're sitting empty, and they're not their primary residence. So there's homes that are just sitting there. So that's one issue that I'd like to talk about. But my burning issue is the zoning. I'd like us to do an update on the zoning.
Through the chair. Well, we've got some kind of things on the shelf right now that commissioners have raised. For example, well, it's right here on the issues update. I have it under not yet scheduled. So discussion of options related to the design review process, housing options and policies. Now, if we go back to this slide right here, that's one reason why we haven't necessarily come to some of these other topics yet, because in addition to the different projects that we're reviewing through the pipeline right now, we're also working on wine tasting regulations as directed by the council. We're also working on cannabis regulations as directed by the council. So, you know, I just want to say that we've got a pretty full plate. I anticipate that the earliest we could do a special meeting that would be devoted to, you know, kind of more commission-driven topics would be in April, if you wanted to schedule something like that. But I would also just add that this is the Planning Commission. Its purview is land use planning. And so tax issues are not within our jurisdiction in this room tonight. Tax issues are a council issue. Zoning is certainly a planning commission issue. And, you know, talking about zoning in the context of an upcoming general plan update might make a lot of sense. But like I say, probably the earliest that could happen would be a special meeting in April.
Well, then I would encourage commissioners to be in contact with planning director and give them their views on what they might like to see, and if something can be put together, if you think it's appropriate, we'll try to move ahead with it. Now I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much.